December 7th, 1941, 7:55 a.m., Oahu. The sky above Entity, point__interest, Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Hawaii, U.S., was clear. Trade winds moved gently across the anchored ships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Sailors were finishing breakfast. Some were still asleep below deck. Church services had begun on shore. Then the sound came, low, mechanical, growing louder. Japanese aircraft descended over Entity, Place, Oahu, Hawaii's island, in tight formation. Torpedo bombers skimmed the water. Dive bombers rolled downward through sunlight. The first explosion shattered the stillness at 7:55 a.m. Battleships moored along Battleship Row became immediate targets. Columns of fire climbed into the air. Steel buckled. Oil spread across the harbor's surface and ignited. The great hull of Entity ship, USS Arizona, Pennsylvania-class battleship, erupted in a catastrophic magazine explosion, tearing the ship apart in seconds. From the air, it appeared decisive. 8 American battleships were hit. Several sank in the shallow harbor. Smoke obscured the mountains beyond. To the planners of the Entity organization, Imperial Japanese Navy, WW2 Naval Force, this was a knockout blow they had envisioned. But beneath the burning oil and twisted steel, something remained. Steel that had not broken, crews that had survived, ships that would rise again. The shock of that survival would not be felt immediately. It would take months, and then years, before Japanese admirals fully understood what had not been destroyed that morning. Before that realization came, the world itself had to change. In 1940, the Pacific balance was already shifting. Japan had been at war in China since 1937. Cities like Shanghai and Nanjing had fallen under imperial control. The leadership in Tokyo believed expansion was essential for security, for prestige, and for resources. The Japanese home islands lacked oil, iron, and rubber. Industrial growth demanded access to Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, the United States watched carefully. President Entity politician Franklin D. Roosevelt, us President WW2 era, had moved the U.S. Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Hawaii in 1940, anchoring at Entity, point__interest, Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Hawaii, U.S., as a visible deterrent. It was a message written in steel. Tensions escalated in 1941. After Japan occupied French Indochina, the United States responded with economic sanctions. In July, Washington froze Japanese assets. Then came the most devastating measure, an oil embargo. Japan imported roughly 80% of its oil from the United States. Without it, the Imperial Navy would eventually be immobilized. Military planners calculated that reserves would last perhaps 2 years. To Japanese leaders, time was shrinking. Within the high command of the Entity organization, Imperial Japanese Navy, WW2 Naval Force, Admiral Entity, military_personnel, Isoroku Yamamoto, Japanese Admiral, argued that war with the United States would be dangerous but perhaps unavoidable. He understood American industrial power. He had studied in the United States. He knew its factories, its resources, its population. If war came, he believed Japan must strike first, and strike hard. The concept was rooted in traditional naval doctrine. Destroy the enemy fleet in one decisive blow. Remove America's ability to project power across the Pacific. Force negotiation before industrial capacity could awaken. The target would not be Manila or Guam. It would be the Pacific Fleet itself. Planning began in secrecy in early 1941. Japanese carrier task forces trained in torpedo drops in shallow water. Special wooden fins were added to prevent torpedoes from plunging too deep into the harbor floor. Pilots rehearsed long-range navigation across open ocean. The strike force would include 6 aircraft carriers, the largest concentration of naval aviation power ever assembled at that time. Yet even within Japan, not all were convinced. Some officers doubted the feasibility of surprise across 3,000 miles of ocean. Others questioned whether battleships alone represented America's true strength. But the decision was made. Operation Z, later known as the attack on Pearl Harbor, would seek to paralyze the United States Pacific Fleet in a single morning. Japanese planners believed American morale was soft. Isolationist sentiment remained strong in 1941. The memory of the First World War still lingered. A crushing defeat might fracture public will. What they could not fully measure was industrial will. American shipyards were already expanding. Congress had passed naval expansion acts in 1938 and 1940. New battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers were under construction even before the first bomb fell. On both sides of the Pacific, steel was being shaped for a war that neither nation would formally declare until it had already begun. By autumn 1941, diplomacy continued in Washington, but it was hollow. Japanese carrier groups secretly assembled in the Kuril Islands. On November 26, the strike force sailed eastward across the North Pacific, maintaining radio silence. Their objective was simple: cripple the fleet, break the backbone of American sea power, buy time, and on December 7, 1941, they believed they had done exactly that. But the smoke rising above Battleship Row did not tell the full story. The first wave struck at 7:55 a.m. Within minutes, torpedoes slammed into the hulls of American battleships lying along Ford Island. Armor-piercing bombs followed. The assault unfolded with precision. Japanese pilots targeted moored ships to maximize damage. Battleship Row became a corridor of fire. The explosion aboard Entity, ship, USS Arizona, Pennsylvania-class battleship, at approximately 8:06 a.m. was catastrophic. A bomb penetrated her forward magazine. The detonation tore the vessel apart, killing over 1,100 sailors instantly. The ship settled into the harbor, a burning ruin. Nearby, Entity's ship, USS Oklahoma, Nevada-class battleship, capsized after multiple torpedo strikes. Entity's ship, USS West Virginia, Colorado-class battleship, sank at her berth. Entity's ship, USS California, Tennessee-class battleship, slowly filled with water. Entity's ship, USS Nevada, Nevada-class battleship, attempted to make a desperate run for open sea before being beached to prevent sinking in the channel. By 10 a.m., the attack was over. 8 battleships had been damaged, for it had sunk in the shallow harbor. Nearly 2,400 Americans were dead. Aircraft lay destroyed across Hickam and Wheeler fields. The harbor was filled with oil, debris, and smoke. To observers in Tokyo, it appeared decisive. Japanese naval leaders believed they had achieved strategic surprise and operational success. Admiral Yamamoto's gamble seemed justified. American capital ships, symbols of sea power, were wrecked in a single morning. Yet even on that day, certain facts stood quietly beneath the destruction. The U.S. Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers were not in port. Entity's ship, USS Enterprise, Yorktown-class aircraft carrier, was returning from Wake Island. Entity's ship, USS Lexington, Lexington-class aircraft carrier, was ferrying aircraft to Midway. Entity, ship, USS Saratoga, Lexington-class aircraft carrier, was in San Diego. The Japanese strike force had missed the vessels that would define the next phase of naval warfare. More critically, Pearl Harbor itself remained operational. Dry docks were intact. Fuel storage facilities were largely untouched. Repair workshops survived. Submarine pens were undamaged. The harbor was wounded, but not destroyed. And most important of all, the water at Pearl Harbor was shallow. The battleships had sunk in mud, not in the open ocean. Their masts and superstructures remained visible above the surface. They were damaged. Some were twisted beyond quick repair. But they were not irretrievable wrecks resting thousands of feet below. Within hours of the attack, American salvage crews began assessing damage. Divers entered oil-filled compartments. They worked by touch, navigating tangled wiring and floating debris. Bodies were recovered slowly. Machinery was inspected piece by piece. Every intact bulkhead mattered. Japanese intelligence, operating at long range, could not immediately confirm the full condition of the American fleet. From aerial photographs and pilot reports, they knew ships had been hit and sunk, but they did not yet know that most would be raised. In Tokyo, celebration was tempered by concern. Yamamoto reportedly remarked that he feared Japan had awakened a sleeping giant, though historians debate the exact phrasing. What is certain is that he understood America's industrial capacity. Still, for months, Japanese planning assumed that the U.S. battleship force had been neutralized for a significant period. The next dimension of the story lies not in strategy alone, but in human endurance and technical resolve. Humans struggle beneath the waterline. When the bombs stopped falling over Entity, point_interest, Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Hawaii, U.S., the battle did not end for the men trapped inside the ships. On board Entity, ship USS West Virginia, Colorado-class battleship, sailors fought flooding compartments in darkness. Water surged through ruptured hull plates. Electrical systems failed. Men sealed hatches to slow the sea, sometimes knowing others remained inside. Survivors later described the sound of tapping from within submerged sections, signals for men who could not escape. On Entity's ship, USS California, Tennessee-class battleship, crew members worked for 3 days to keep the vessel afloat before she finally settled into the mud. Fires burned across decks. Oil-covered sailors slipped as they dragged hoses into smoke-filled corridors. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. The effort to save lives and preserve ships lasted weeks. Divers entered flooded compartments in total darkness. They worked by touch, cutting through twisted metal and clearing debris. Bodies were recovered slowly. Machinery was inspected piece by piece. Every intact bulkhead mattered. From the beginning, the United States Navy treated these vessels not as losses, but as assets awaiting recovery. Industrial ingenuity in a shallow harbor. Because Pearl Harbor was shallow, most battleships rested upright or on their sides within reachable depth. Salvage operations began almost immediately under Rear Admiral William Furlong. Naval engineers evaluated hull breaches, structural stress, and machinery damage. The process was systematic. First, fires were extinguished. Then watertight integrity was restored. Steel patches were welded over torpedo holes. Massive pumps were installed. Temporary power systems were rigged. Compartments were cleared of debris to reduce weight. On Entity, ship, USS Nevada, Nevada-class battleship, emergency repairs allowed her to refloat within weeks. She would sail to Puget Sound for full reconstruction by early 1942. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. Hundreds of divers worked in rotation. Floating cranes lifted damaged gun turrets weighing hundreds of tons. New radar systems were planned even before hulls were fully stabilized. What had appeared from the air as wreckage was, in practice, recoverable infrastructure. Japanese planners had assumed that sunken battleships equaled permanent removal from combat. They had calculated tonnage destroyed. They had not calculated American shipyard capacity. At the same time salvage crews worked in Hawaii, West Coast naval yards expanded production. The United States had already passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act in 1940, authorizing massive expansion. The attack accelerated everything. Repair merged with modernization. The battleships would not simply return as they had been. They would return stronger. Tactical reality, battleships in a changing war. In 1941, battleships were still widely viewed as the core of naval dominance. Japan's entire strategy had revolved around crippling America's battle line. Yet naval warfare was already evolving. Aircraft carriers were rising in importance. The absence of American carriers at Pearl Harbor would soon prove decisive at the Entity Battle of Midway, 1942 Pacific Naval Battle. But the survival of the battleships carried a different kind of value. They represented heavy artillery platforms capable of shore bombardment and surface engagement. In the island campaigns that followed, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, these ships would provide massive gunfire support. Japanese intelligence initially underestimated how quickly the United States could adapt. Even damaged battleships could serve as floating anti-aircraft batteries once repaired. Their reconstruction plans included upgraded radar, improved anti-aircraft guns, and enhanced fire control systems. The war that Japan envisioned, one decisive fleet engagement, was gradually transforming into a long campaign of attrition and logistics. Battleships that survived Pearl Harbor would not seek a single grand clash in the traditional sense. They would escort carriers. They would bombard fortified beaches. They would guard supply lines stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. And when they reappeared in combat zones once considered secure, Their silhouettes would carry a message far beyond their guns. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been intended to eliminate American sea power in one stroke. Instead, it triggered a transformation. Steel that had sunk would be raised. Crews that had endured would return to sea, and the belief in a swift victory would begin to erode. Japanese strategic assumption. In Tokyo, the early months of 1942 seemed to validate the decision to strike first. After the attack on Entity, __interest, Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Hawaii, U.S., Japanese forces advanced rapidly across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. The Philippines fell. British forces surrendered at Singapore. The Dutch East Indies were seized. Guam and Wake Island were captured. Within the high command of the Entity Organization, Imperial Japanese Navy, WW2 Naval Force, the assumption remained consistent. The American battleship force had been neutralized for a prolonged period. Even as some vessels were refloated, they were expected to require years of repair. Japanese doctrine rested on the concept of Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet battle. The Pearl Harbor strike had been intended to weaken the U.S. Navy so severely that when the inevitable surface confrontation occurred in the Western Pacific, Japan would hold the advantage. But intelligence reports throughout 1942 began to complicate this picture. Signals, intercepts, reconnaissance sightings, and submarine observations suggested that some of the damaged ships were no longer inert. Dry dock activity at Hawaii was intense. American industrial output was accelerating beyond previous estimates. Admiral Entity, military_personnel, Isoroku Yamamoto, Japanese admiral, had warned before the war that he could run wild for 6 months but could promise nothing afterward. By mid-1942, those 6 months were nearly over. The Japanese Navy had inflicted damage. It had not eliminated American capacity. The next angles reveal how Japanese leadership interpreted these developments and how shocks slowly replaced certainty. Reconstruction as reinvention. When the damaged battleships left Hawaii for West Coast shipyards, they did not return in their original form. At Puget Sound Naval Shipyard and other facilities, reconstruction became transformation. On Entity's ship, USS West Virginia, Colorado-class battleship, massive structural repairs were undertaken. Her superstructure was rebuilt. Older cage masts were replaced with tower masts. Advanced radar systems were installed. Anti-aircraft batteries were dramatically increased. The same process reshaped Entity, ship, USS California, Tennessee-class battleship, and Entity, ship, USS Tennessee, Tennessee-class battleship. Fire control systems were modernized. Compartmentalization improved survivability. Torpedo protection was strengthened. These ships emerged not merely repaired, but upgraded for a new kind of war. Radar allowed them to detect aircraft and surface vessels beyond visual range. Enhanced anti-aircraft armament prepared them for carrier-centric operations. Improved damage control systems reflected lessons learned under fire. By late 1943, several of the once sunken battleships were returning to active duty. Their silhouettes were altered. Their capabilities expanded. Their crews retrained for amphibious support and carrier screening roles. They were no longer symbols of a pre-war fleet anchored in harbor. They were instruments of sustained offensive power. The moment of recognition. The Pacific War unfolded across vast distances. News traveled through reconnaissance reports and intercepted transmissions. Yet by 1943 and 1944, Japanese naval officers could no longer dismiss the evidence. Battleships believed crippled at Pearl Harbor were participating in bombardments of Japanese-held islands. At Guadalcanal, American naval strength stabilized the campaign. In the Central Pacific Drive, shore bombardments preceded amphibious landings. Massive 14 and 16-inch guns pounded fortifications before Marines advanced. When these vessels reappeared, they carried historical memory with them. Japanese officers who had celebrated their sinking in December 1941 now face reports that those same ships were firing again. The psychological dimension was subtle but real. Pearl Harbor had been conceived as a demonstration of Japanese initiative and superiority. It was intended to project inevitability, that America could be struck decisively and forced into defensive retreat. The survival and return of those battleships disrupted that narrative. It signaled that the United States possessed not only resilience but industrial endurance. Damage did not equal disappearance. Loss did not mean surrender. By 1944, as the Pacific War shifted toward the Philippines, the full weight of American naval reconstruction will become impossible to ignore. The decisive moment was approaching, not in a single surprise attack, but in the visible return of ships that had once burned in a Hawaiian harbor. The transformation did not happen in a single dramatic launch. It happened slowly, methodically, through mud, oil, and steel. In the weeks after December 7th, 1941, salvage teams at Eddy, point_of_interest, Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Hawaii, U.S., faced a question that would shape the war: which ships could be saved and how quickly. The harbor still smelled of burned fuel. Divers descended into cold, black water. Visibility was measured in inches. Inside submerged compartments, they worked by touch, cutting through twisted metal and clearing debris. Pumps ran constantly, forcing water from ruptured hulls. On Entity, ship, USS West Virginia, Colorado-class battleship, 7 torpedo hits had torn open the port side. Fires had raged for hours, yet her keel remained largely intact. Salvage crews sealed hull breaches with steel patches and concrete cofferdams. Thousands of tons of water were pumped out. Ammunition and equipment were removed to lighten the vessel. By May 1942, West Virginia was refloated. On Entity, ship, USS California, Tennessee-class battleship. Flooding had spread slowly due to open hatches during inspection at the time of attack. The ship settled evenly into the harbor bottom. Engineers installed temporary bulkheads and restored buoyancy compartment by compartment. She was refloated in March 1942. Entity's ship, USS Nevada, Nevada-class battleship, which had attempted to escape the harbor under fire, was repaired enough to sail to Puget Sound by February 1942. Their reconstruction began immediately. The exception was Entity's ship, USS Arizona, Pennsylvania-class battleship. The magazine explosion had destroyed her beyond recovery. She would remain where she fell, a permanent memorial. But 6 of the 8 battleships damaged that morning would eventually return to service. October 1944. American forces moved to fulfill a promise made in 1942, the return to Philippines. General Entity, military underscore personnel, Douglas MacArthur, US General WW2, waited ashore at Leyte, declaring that he had come back. Behind the landing craft stretched one of the largest naval armadas ever assembled. Within it sailed ships that had once burned at Pearl Harbor. The operation triggered the Entity Battle of Leyte Gulf, 1944 Pacific Naval Battle, the largest naval engagement in history. Japanese Naval Command recognized the stakes immediately. Admiral Entity, military underscore personnel, Takeo Kurita, Japanese Admiral WW2, led the powerful center force through the sea beyond sea and toward the narrow waters of Surigao Strait. Waiting in Surigao Strait was a battle line drawn from history. Among the American ships positioned across the strait were West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania. Several had been damaged on December 7, 1941. Radar guided their guns in darkness before Japanese lookouts could visually confirm targets. At 3:53 a.m., West Virginia opened fire using radar-directed targeting. Among the first times battleship guns were aimed entirely by electronic detection. 16-inch shells arced across the strait. Yamashiro was struck repeatedly. Fires erupted. Destroyers and cruisers exchanged torpedoes. Within hours, Yamashiro capsized and sank. The ships once left submerged in a Hawaiian harbor were now delivering precise, overwhelming firepower. The symbolism was unavoidable. The Pearl Harbor strike had been intended to eliminate America's battle line. Instead, that line, modernized and radar-equipped, executed the final battleship versus battleship engagement in history. It was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a strategic reversal. Leyte Gulf shattered Japan's remaining surface fleet strength. Battleships were sunk or crippled. Heavy cruisers were lost. Destroyer screens depleted. Fuel shortages became critical. For Japanese naval planners, the implications were unmistakable. The Pearl Harbor strike had aimed to buy time. That perimeter had now been breached. American forces advanced island by island, supported by overwhelming naval gunfire and carrier aviation. The return of the once-sunken battleships symbolized resilience. Damage did not equal disappearance. Loss did not mean surrender. By late 1944, Japanese strategy grew increasingly defensive. Kamikaze attacks emerged as desperation tactics. Meanwhile, the repaired battleships continued to bombard fortifications and support amphibious landings. American commanders could rely on sustained firepower across thousands of miles of ocean. Logistics were secure. Supply lines held. Japanese attempts to challenge these operations became increasingly ineffective. By early 1945, the consequences were undeniable. American shipyards produced new battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers at unprecedented rates. The rebuilt Pearl Harbor veterans served as templates for modernization. Their guns softened fortified positions at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Anti-aircraft batteries defended against kamikaze waves. Radar-directed targeting allowed engagement at night or in poor visibility. Japanese planners recognized their strategic miscalculation. The assumption that sunken battleships meant permanent elimination had been flawed. The Kantai-Kessen Doctrine, decisive surface battle, was effectively dead. Pearl Harbor survivors symbolized endurance, industrial power, and human ingenuity. The U.S. Navy could absorb catastrophic damage and regenerate strength, altering both tactical and strategic calculations. The story of the Pearl Harbor battleships is one of resilience and transformation. Ships that burned, sank, and seemed lost forever became symbols of recovery and determination. Steel that had sunk would be raised. Crews that had endured would return to sea. For Americans, the rebuilt battleships demonstrated industrial capacity and technical ingenuity. They were integral to amphibious operations, providing firepower, protection, and stability. For Japanese planners, the return of these vessels was a harsh lesson in miscalculation. Ships once thought destroyed now fired upon Japanese positions, reminding leaders of the limits of tactical victories. Ultimately, the Pearl Harbor battleships exemplify a broader truth. Loss can be temporary, and recovery, grounded in skill, organization, and perseverance, can redefine outcomes. Their endurance bridged the devastation of December 7, 1941, with the triumphs of 1944-45, leaving an indelible mark on naval warfare, strategy, and human resolve.